So a very common question I get is how many people are using AI in the supply chain and what exactly are they using it for? I'm not an expert in that, but our guest this week is coming right up. So Deborah Dull, welcome back to the channel. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
And we're going to be talking about AI use in circularity. We might
That's
have
right.
to talk a little bit about what circularity is and then the AI bit. And I'm
Yeah.
hoping you can answer this question because I don't have a lot of consulting clients really using AI that much, but you're right in that space. So I'm sure we're going to hear
Yep.
all about that. So in a nutshell, what's circularity and where is AI being used?
Which is a great topic for quite a few components of answers. So thanks again for having me back. We'll start with thinking about circularity. I've been in this space now for almost a decade, actually, which is amazing to think about. And still a lot of people think about circularity like recycling. And recycling is absolutely a piece of the puzzle. But the entire idea of circulating resources within a region, let's say, is that we can get more value out of those resources before they're retired. If we do this properly, we can go faster, we can be more resilient, and we can save a bunch of margin. So some examples might look like a repair first operation or a reuse operation. In supply chain, that might be reusing pallets, that might be reusing water, which is happening more and more as it's become more and more scarce. It could look like reusing or repairing our assets, which of course we do all the time. And then we can start to imagine co-locating our facilities with a packaging manufacturer, for example, who might use a different type of material for their packaging. They might grow it with biology instead of mining it from the planet. And why would we do all of this? The research shows us that we're actually running out of metals in the planet. We have less than 50 years of known mineable gold, platinum, silver,
Wow.
all of the items that are running our societies today. We can't really do anything, toast some toasters, go through a stoplight, certainly not work on our computers without these really important metals. So if we can't get it from the planet, we need to get it from someplace else, and someplace else is other supply chains. If we rely solely on recycling, it's really hard on the material often, and it's hard on our pocketbooks. It takes a lot of time and effort and money in order to return that material back into a value chain. If we start looking though at repair, at remanufacturing, at harvesting components, which is actually what most, if not all of the hyperscalers are doing right now, is they're upgrading these servers that support AI. Then we can start to actually respond quicker to the advancements in technology, upgrade our equipment, and keep a hold of those materials that we worked so hard to take out of the planet and put into society. We can give them multiple chances to add value to our supply chains.
That's fascinating. Now, people might be wondering, what do you know about circularity? I hear you're bringing out a book on the topic. Tell us about that.
Oh, thank you, Rob. I am, yes, actually. This is my first published book through a publisher. I've self-published a few books on Amazon, one on circular supply chains
Mm.
and the other on sustainable supply chains. And this book, the publisher called Kogan Page out of the UK
Oh,
approached
yeah.
me a few years ago about writing this book. So it's a fairly comprehensive 436 page
Wow.
user's guide, resource guide to the capabilities required to create a circular supply chain. So how the book is structured is there's 15 capabilities spread across people, process, technology, standards, and governance. So how do we talk across industries and how do we make sure that we wrap everything in the right governance structures? And each of those 5 categories have 3 capabilities underneath. And I visit each of those across 4 themes, such as repairing locally, or even something called urban mining, where we start to use the materials that are in our cities instead of in the planet. And for each of those cross sections, I introduce maturity levels and give you some questions to identify where you are in the maturity level so you can figure out what you need to do next. Now, as a resource guide, it's pretty comprehensive. It has examples for all of those different maturity
Mm.
levels that I've mentioned. And as I was writing it, I thought, resource guides are helpful as a resource. So you pick it up, kind of see where you are and put it back down again. But if we want to truly understand what the experience of this would look like to run a circular supply chain, we sort of need a narrative. And so at the beginning of each of the 4 sections, similar to the goal, if anybody read that in their
Oh, I see where this
careers,
is going.
I started a short vignette at the beginning of each of these sections, but I wanted to write
Yeah.
more than just a short vignette. I am not a novelist, but I asked my publisher it was okay to take that concept into a standalone companion novel.
Yeah.
Again, not a novelist. So I actually used AI in the creation of this novel. I worked together with Claude AI and got that published just recently. So it's a really sweet,
Wow.
short, few-hour read about a woman called Maya living in London, head of supply chain resilience, and she goes to
Oh,
circular strategies in order to offset a lot of the delays that they have in getting their inbound parts coming in.
that sounds amazing. You know, funnily enough, I read a couple of books on supply chain a few years ago, and one was written as a novel, and it was all about China sourcing,
Oh,
and, and it had a
cool.
love story woven through it.
It's quite
That's,
cool.
that's
I've
hilarious.
always thought it was interesting, but of course, I'm not a novelist, and this is where
Yeah,
one of the use cases I think where AI is quite interesting.
yeah,
And then we can talk a little bit about the environmental impacts of AI, which
yeah.
I'm starting to write about now as well. But as a tool for us to learn, I think it's quite
Mm,
transformative for society. That said, I am starting just now a book chapter for Anshuman Kaur, who was my thesis advisor actually a decade ago.
right.
And the book is all about AI and sustainability. And so my book chapter is Can AI ever be circular? Because, of course, when we think about AI, it's living on a cloud. A cloud is a real
Yeah.
physical place, and there's physical metals. Some of those are
Mm,
hard to find. And there's water and energy and coolant and spare parts and all this
yeah.
maintenance that goes into keeping the cloud running. And so I'm going to start looking at some of the newer
Mm,
innovations of water reuse, for example. If you have a medium-sized conversation with one of these AI tools today, it's more than a bottle of wine's worth of water. Ask a query, and that's as much water as you're
really?
using.
Wow.
So it's an interesting one that we don't know a ton about. There's not a lot of research
Mm,
published yet, but I think it'll be an important one to start
that's
investigating
fascinating.
so we can make good choices.
So, what's the name of the book, and where do we get it? And we'll give it a
So
plug
the
down
book is
below.
going to be, I'll give you the link. It's not going to come out until next year. It's
Oh
just kicking
no!
up
Yeah,
right
yeah, been
now.
teasing us.
The no, so that's the book that I'm writing the chapter for. My book is called Circular Supply Chain. That's
Yeah, that
coming
one.
out
Yeah,
June 3rd, rest of world, and the last Tuesday of June is June 24th. Will be in the United States.
excellent, excellent. So, do provide me a link, and we'll put the link down below, folks, so you can go and check it
I
out.
will
That
do.
sounds great.
Will
So,
do.
that was a quick recap on circularity, but we're talking about AI and circularity. So, since we last spoke, you've been in a different role, and so how are you getting into this AI thing? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So since we last spoke, I've gone through quite a wonderful journey, really, of being able to spend some time with supply chain executives. I was an industry analyst for a few years, which gave me the chance to sit down, think about these futuristic topics that I spend so much time thinking about, and then how to ground those into the boardroom and helping to support the conversations happening at the CSCO and CSCO -1 level. And as those conversations unfolded, especially through this last year, with the explosion of AI, comes the question of what do I do with this? I'm getting a lot of pressure, and there must be an efficiency play here, but what does a use case look like? And really, what does this feel like? And I'll unpack that a little bit. But what that meant was uh, last year, I started thinking about this idea of starting an advisory company. Early this year, joined a family office called Kaplan Ventures. So happily part of a cohort of investment companies, all focused on technology and technology for good. And so as we start to think about this world of advising, what does it mean to advise for AI and these AI first companies that are newer and purpose built? And what I mean by that is one of my partners um, actually uses AI agents, and we'll talk about what that means, to configure their software. So in order to get a workflow created, you can write it all down on a piece of paper and take a picture, you can type it all out. And within just a few minutes, 2.5 on airplane Wi-Fi in my experience, it starts to create your smart workflow, which you can then configure. So the time to value for software and supportive software for the team is a totally different story than it was even a year ago. Some of the components that makes this possible are threefold. One, We have large amounts of publicly available data on the internet. So this is in all languages, in natural language, and societal norms like puns and jokes, what's serious business language and what's fun, jovial language. All of this has become available in the public domain. So that's one big building block. The second is a type of neural network called transformative neural networks. And this is a different way for computers to relate information to other information. And neural networks by themselves are only about a decade, 12 years old in reality. So this is an advancement in technology. The third piece is the hardware that supports our servers is getting more and more and more advanced. Of course, it sounds silly to say it out loud, but that stepwise function change allows the speed of computations needed. And what that allows us to do then is to create an experience where quote, reading documents becomes a lot easier than it used to be. And it's not just natural language processing, it's also the ability, for example, to read handwritten notes, to read pictures of PDFs. And so now as we start to think about processing very old contracts or processing border documentation in the case of something like PFAS, which is a group of chemicals which many governments around the world are becoming very interested in managing because of the toxicity that they bring. Some of those requirements say, hey, in the last 20 years, we need to understand what has crossed a border. And AI is a great tool to help sift through thousands and millions of pages of border documentation that might be handwritten, it might be shortened. So we have to kind of figure out this group of thousands of chemicals that make up a category called PFAS. So as we start thinking about this land of artificial intelligence and agents, we start to create miniature goals for these agents to complete, string those together, and we can start to have more autonomy and a smarter way to manage a process, and something that we all may remember from a decade ago, like RPA, which kind of has to follow the same steps every time. But now we can start to make better, quote, judgment calls in the moment of the right decision to make. And we can unpack all of that, of course.
Wow. Where do we start? So let me be blunt here. How much of this is sort of nice to have, dreaming, really cool, sometime in the future, and how much is people are actually using this kind of technology now?
It's happening right now. I'll give you an example. As we think about the extreme speed in decision and implementation of today's tariffs, typically speaking, when tariffs have been implemented, there's a review period and there's a time for business leaders and government to come together. That's not the case right now for the United States. As we start to need to find out information about our upstream supply chains, one of the accepted methodologies right now is to contact our suppliers. Some of my customers have 10,000, 15,000 suppliers that they need to contact all at one time and ask about questions like, where is your aluminum smelted? What percentage of value for your product can defensively say it's in the United States? And then you can go on and apply for exceptions. Now, to reach out to 20,000 suppliers all at one time is possible to do. The challenge comes in when they reply. And they might fill out a form, but they might reply in natural language. They might reply partially. They might reply with a question. They might reply with an attached form that you then need to go through. And so this type of scale is extremely difficult for human teams to be able to keep up with, especially when the requirements change so frequently. So this is a process that happens today that we were able to configure quite quickly in order to manage the responses, both the reach out, but again, that's not really the challenge anymore. It's the response. So every response gets effectively a customized experience. If it's in natural language, in English, Chinese, French, any kind of language. And if there's a question, then there can be a back and forth handled through these AI agents. And so that a human doesn't need to go off and do that. Then the results are placed in structured database. Then that could be queried and presented, for example, to border and customs.
That's amazing.
It's pretty amazing. It's a little bit, I'm going to be honest, it's a little freaky when we think about what's possible. But when I've sat with a lot of supply chain teams these last couple of weeks, and they show up bleary-eyed and really tired, and they're obviously not sleeping. And to be able to take this burden off of them so that they can start thinking about the true tariff engineering and restructuring their supply chains and trying to figure out the strategic decisions that they need to make and the relationship-based work that needs to happen, to
Yeah.
remove this off of their plate is really a moment of relief. And that,
Mm.
I think, is really quite special, to take off the amount of work it takes a supply chain professional to just get to do supply chain every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is a lot. So if we can move some of that busy work off their plates,
Mm.
then they can start to do the creative problem solving and the strategy that humans
Mm.
still have a leg up in doing that work. And
Yeah.
I think that's where our team's time is best placed.
So there might be people watching this thinking, oh, this is getting scary, and AI is going to take over. And I had sort of a flash through my mind there. There's a video doing the rounds of I don't know. I think there's an AI bot calling a hotel to make a booking or something, and they both realize they're AI bots, and they go, oh, we don't need to talk to each other, and then it's just beep 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 beep, and they
Yeah,
communicate.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
are we going to get to the point where we're managing supply chains and AI is talking to AI, and we're kind of cut out of the loop, and we cross our fingers and hope the product turns up? Hang on, it was
Yeah,
supposed to have four wheels. It's got six.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I think the potential is immense. And I think there's a world where we actually do want AI talking to AI, and there's
Mm.
some work in the AI community to create new protocols which will
Mm.
allow cross AI language effectively to
Mm.
happen. Which, if we think about anybody who's been involved in a technology implementation, the amount of time
Yeah.
it takes just to get systems to talk to each other, and field
Mm.
mapping, and all of that is often what makes these big technology implementations take so long.
Mm.
And so if we can effectively eliminate the need to do that, then we're going to be able to take advantage of a lot more technology, and our supply chains can perform a lot better. Now, one of my fears is actually not that we're going to end up in the matrix, although I make a lot of
Mm.
jokes about that.
Yeah.
One of my fears is actually, as a Six Sigma trained problem solver, my worry is that we will no longer understand Gemba, as in the place the real work
Mm.
happens. One of the reasons why we're so effective at problem solving is because we're the ones that sit through the day in, day out, and have to deal with all the
Yeah.
pain of a poor
Mm.
process. And so then we say, we know what can work and can't work because we've lived through
Mm.
that process day in, day out. So I wonder if we'll start having what I'm calling reverse boot camps,
Yeah.
where maybe once a quarter or twice a year, maybe even just once a year, we pull some of our teams together to run our supply chain by hand. And maybe it's a supply chain process. But
Mm.
I think it's important that we remember how to do our supply chain, how to do MRP, how to cut a purchase
Mm.
order. It's almost like the ability to parallel park our car, even though
Yeah.
they're learning how to do that ourselves. And they're probably better at it.
Yeah.
However, it's probably good that we know how to park our car. And so we should remember
Yeah.
how to run all these processes by hand, so that we can design the processes of the future,
Mm.
and to be able to wrap these systems in layers of authority
Mm.
and supervision. Because ultimately we need to make sure that the dashboards are clear on
Mm.
what's really happening
Yeah.
on the ground. There's a lot of processes I think will benefit from humans not needing to be involved in.
Yeah, you paint a really good picture there of AI having a fantastic place where it's dealing with masses of data, and particularly interrogating data, interpreting that. And I was thinking, wow, there's so much of our sort of consulting work that we do where we're diving into product master data, and there's all the errors and duplication, and what a wonderful thing to throw AI at. Um, but in a more practical sense, I suppose, for some people watching, maybe who are not seeing it in terms of dealing with mass data, um, what about operating warehouses? 50,000 pallet lights out warehouses. I mean, those have been around, to be honest, for 30 years. But are you seeing any more of those sort of operational applications and uses of AI?
Definitely. One note on master data, I'll say I have 3 projects underway right now of self-healing master data, which is what you're describing. So multiple
Oh,
sources
wow.
of truth, multiple versions of data,
Yeah.
of master data, both in supply chains and actually also in the fintech world, for like customer data. So
Mm.
they might have 7 or 8 different addresses on file for a
Mm.
customer, and how do they know which one to use? And
Yeah.
so we actually have a self-healing process in place, which is quite interesting. Um, Warehouse, really cool work. Just speaking last week actually with somebody who leads an organization with 65 warehouses across the United States. And he said the amount of time that their team is spending on cycle counting every single day
Mm.
is really becoming out of hand. And we work with a drone-based cycle counting company, which
Mm.
is really, really interesting. They can do vision, but they can also do RFID reading as
Mm.
they fly up and down the warehouse, which is a cool use of technology when we think about the amount of time and frankly wasted time
Mm.
of humans going up and down, physically
Mm.
up and down and up and down and
Yeah.
counting by hand,
Yeah.
especially because sometimes what's inside a pallet isn't what we think it is. So there's been a lot of times you open a pallet up, take a couple boxes out, and the inside of the pallet's a different product.
Mm.
So it's a lot of error when we have to rely on humans. And I've never talked to a single person in a warehouse who loves cycle counting.
Yeah.
So to be able to move that off their plate
Mm.
is a nice thing to do.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. What's the future of AI? I mean, I think certainly for me and for a lot of people watching this, it's probably a lot more advanced than we imagined. How easy is it to look out even 5 years and sort of with a view of what it could be?
Very, very difficult. I think 5 years, if we imagine, not even imagine, if we look back in the last 12 months,
Mm.
even what we thought was 2030 capability is happening
Mm.
now. So the speed is happening quickly. The cautionary tale here is that governance and cross-industry working groups and working closely with policymakers is really, really important
Mm.
to put the right guardrails in place. I think there's a lot lacking in education around
Mm.
what this technology really is. You even have the head of these huge companies asking for more regulation
Mm.
because as the hardware advances, um, there is some pretty scary stuff that can happen. So
Yeah.
there's a chip that Microsoft has managed to make, which is under lock and key in a secret location and all this stuff,
Mm.
as they start getting into quantum. And apparently this chip, which is like the size of a fingernail, is more powerful than every computer on the world combined, including all of our computers and smartphones and all the supercomputers, and put those all together.
Yeah.
And that can happen in this little chip. And so if we imagine the work of an AI agent combined with this
Mm.
super hardware, then computer systems become irrelevant at that point, as in there's no
Mm.
cybersecurity barrier in
Yeah.
the world that can stop these. So I do think that there's a world where advancements are happening quicker than we're ready for. And as this hardware comes on with the more advanced compute and algorithms, I think that there's a space where we're going to really be at risk. But hopefully, and I know hope is not a strategy, we can all come together around using this technology to make society work better for people,
Yeah.
and hopefully keep the bad guys off the internet.
Yeah, that's the tricky one. I'm sort of reflecting back 20 years ago, listening to you there, and hearing people talk about implementing new ERP systems and warehouse management systems and things like that. And we would always say to them, get the process right first. You don't want to automate a bad process because your train wreck will just happen at the speed of light. With
Yep.
AI, whoa.
Yeah, but it's interesting one actually, because we usually in the consulting world say something like
Mm.
make it great, then automate.
Yeah.
And I challenge this paradigm a little bit because
Mm.
traditionally we wouldn't want to make a bad process faster because there's some sort of an innate waste or a human impact that we're going to end up paying for.
Mm.
But AI doesn't really care if the process could be a little bit more efficient. So
Mm.
I'm somewhat of a mind of, if your team is underwater, and every team I speak to is,
Mm.
can we take the burden off their shoulders for a period of time? So shift off their busy work and allow a messy process to work. And a messy process might
Mm.
simply mean it takes 4 or 5 emails back and forth with a supplier before something can get cut. Fine. For a human, that really sucks. For an AI, who cares?
Mm.
And I'm saying this with, air quotes, who
Yeah.
cares? However, we want to make sure that we come back and say, is this process responsible from a server space perspective and a compute
Mm.
perspective, so that we're designing processes which fit well with a responsible compute strategy? But I do think that the barrier to entry of my data needs to be perfect and my process needs to be perfect before I introduce technology, I don't
Mm.
think that's necessarily true anymore. We can use a lot of technology
Mm.
even if, quote, my data is bad, we need to start looking at what data exactly do we mean is bad for which decision do we need to make. There's a lot that we can do today. I keep going back to reading contracts. I've got a lot of customers who leave a lot of value on the table because their contracts are done and posted on a SharePoint somewhere, but completely disconnected to the rest of the operation. So if we get an early payment benefit or some volume discount that we're actually not being honored against because we never go back to the contract. So there's some small use cases which can actually save a lot of money for the company, which doesn't require any of the company's data to be clean. We can use it exactly as it is today.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Wow, we've talked about a lot there. Oh, this is
We sure
exhausting.
have.
What do we cover? We've got a recap for people here. So we talked about circularity, which is great. We're going to put a link to your book down below. We've touched on AI agents. We've looked at the really cool use of AI in the supply chain and mass data and where it's headed. Wow, I think that's enough for one session.
I think it's enough for one session.
Yeah, Deborah, it's so good to talk to you again. It's been so long. Are you okay if we put a couple of links down below? We'll put a link to your book, LinkedIn, things like that, if you want to reach out to Deborah. And you got to follow Deborah on this stuff. You learn some really cool stuff. So thank you so much for joining us again. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me on.